Okay. So this is our presentation. Whoops. On our indicator, real GDP, over the Federal Reserve's latest tightening cycle. I'm Harrison Magulon.
Sam Foles. I'm Jack Howard.
Excellent. To under the introduction, Sam.
So the indicator we were focusing on was real GDP. So in analyzing real GDP, we want to answer how the Federal Reserve implements policies to accommodate growth. So first off, what is real GDP? So per Investopedia, real GDP is an inflation-adjusted measure that reflects the value of all goods and services produced by an economy in a given period of time. And it is calculated by an equation where real GDP equals nominal GDP over the deflator. So this statistic is adjusted for inflation so we can see real values for the goods and services produced, compare it with real GDP from other time periods. So real GDP can also be managed through other areas such as the money supply and the interest rate. So from the money supply, central banks can utilize quantitative easing and open market operations to influence how much liquidity or credit is available in the economy. Thus, this affects the money supply, and real GDP can be influenced by that. And then as for the interest rates, changing the levels of interest rates allows for central banks to influence the borrowing costs, which can incite or deter investments, borrowing, consumption, consumer spending, and that all can come to affect real GDP.
Data and descriptive statistics. Just give a quick rundown. Our data collection obviously focused on real GDP since the Federal Reserve's most recent tightening period began March 16th, 2022. Gathered our data from the Fred website of St. Louis, originating from the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis. Data we're working with is quarterly, but we had to make a couple manipulations, obviously when creating graphs, by annualizing the data best represent kind of the graph. The sample is obviously taken from the U.S. economy. To our knowledge, some of the questions regarding descriptive statistics are not applicable to real GDP, sample size, attrition, non-response, missing data, so on and so forth. Overall, the information presented from Fred on the real GDP appears to provide a pretty strong background of the real GDP in the US. That being said, the data likely could not be externally valid to other countries. It appears that it is obviously exclusive to the US. Jack, take it over.
So in order to better understand real GDP in the context of the transmission mechanism and the Federal Reserve, we want to offer up this schematic, which was thought of by Mishkin in his 1996 paper. And this reflects a relationship between output and interest rates, as well as the expectation of interest rates and then investment. So according to the schematic, beginning from left to right, an increase in interest rates will positively affect the rates expected by consumers and investors in the economy. This expected increased interest rate will drive down investment spending, which will also drive down output of the economy. In this case, our indicator is real GDP, so Y can reflect real GDP. That will push down inflation, in response to which the Fed will decrease rates. Then investment spending will increase as a result of a decreased cost of borrowing, resulting in an increase in output or real GDP. We wanted to do some analysis and see if the federal funds rate would increase or decrease in response to changes in GDP. And we looked specifically at the data from 2021 and 2022 in order to do so. We were considering just looking at the 2022 data since the most recent trough, but we decided to also look at the 2021 data so that we could see year-over-year growth rates, as well as just look a little bit more at the trends over time. So this figure reflects the relationship between the federal funds rate, which is the yellow line, and on the right vertical axis, and the real GDP of 2021 and 2022 in billions of dollars on the left vertical axis. And the relationship that we saw through this depiction was that even as real GDP is increasing and the economy is expanding, so are federal fund rates. And this reflects that even if the economy is in an expansionary period, the Federal Reserve's dual mandate might necessitate that it is increasing rates rather than decreasing rates. Furthermore, the increase of rates is in order to decrease inflation and hold off inflation. Yeah. So, this graph shows 2022 and 2021 real GDP next to each other. 2021 real GDP was increasing more steadily over the quarters. We believe in response to the great dip that it took in 2020 as a result of COVID. And then we can see that 2022 real GDP had a shallower slope, so it was increasing at a lesser rate, but it was still increasing over the 4 quarters. This figure is the real GDP growth rate, and so we were able to calculate the initial minus, or sorry, the initial, yeah, actually, that was basically this was calculated by taking the initial minus the recent and then dividing it by the initial. And so rather than getting just the 2022 data, we're comparing it to the 2021 data. And as you can see in comparison, 2022's growth rates were decreasing, but even such, the federal funds rate was still increasing. And so we can tell that the Federal Reserve is going to continue to try to stave off inflation, even if real GDP is not actively growing.
And then some concluding thoughts. We found that when looking at our data and real GDP trends, most shocks to the system are very deterministic. Our economy bounces back and has responded to shocks without kind of permanent catastrophic damages. An example we obviously used was, although real GDP plummeted during COVID, that was one of the most unprecedented kind of events to happen in US history. The Fed was still able to implement policy, and our government made some decisions to kind of help our high yield economy recover over time. We think this indicator is important to keep an eye on, real GDP, obviously, as it's arguably the most important indicator of our economy's overall health. And in our opinion, the economy is chugging along at a decent pace. Despite what some say, the consecutive quarters of negative growth should not panic policymakers. We should continue for a little bit in our slight rising of the federal funds rate until our inflationary target's been met. The Fed has been lowering the rates in which they increase the rates. So now we're just increasing the federal funds rate much smaller than we were before, which shows that we're kind of getting to a good spot with our inflationary targets. But then I think we can become even more expansionary, begin to lower rates once this kind of inflationary target has been hit, so we can get those GDP growth rates back to the positive spot where we want them. So anyways, these are our references. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Awesome work, fellas.